The Israelites are nearing the end of their wandering in the wilderness. So they've been at it a full 40 years. And as they near their destination, they're finally getting close to the Jordan River and being able to cross over. They meet resistance from other nations who attack them. But God gives them success, and they begin occupying territory on the east side of the Jordan. So the land God promised is actually on the west side of the Jordan River. So these nations who felt threatened by the nation of Israel did so needlessly, it would appear. However, when they attacked God's chosen people, God came to their defense and rewarded his people with the lands of the attacking nations on the east side of the Jordan River too. So shortly before the Israelites headed across the Jordan, they encamp on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River across from their first real obstacle, which will be Jericho. But Moab's king Balak is entirely freaked out. He's heard the stories of their departure from Egypt. He knows how they're now succeeding militarily and realizes he doesn't stand a chance if they choose to go to war with him. Additionally, because there are so many of them, they're liable to deplete the natural resources. At least that's what he fears. He knows how other nations have failed against them, but he still wants to chase them off. However, rather than going out and attacking them head on, as the other now conquered groups have done, Balak tries a different tactic. He hires a sorcerer to curse the people in hopes of weakening them to the point that he and his people will then be able to overpower them. It appears that Balak understands that he needs help of a higher power to defeat these trespassers. Their small g God is obviously blessing their efforts. He decides to counter this blessing by bringing in someone to curse them. What he doesn't understand is that he's not merely taking on a god of one people group, such as the idols worshipped by the Amorites, the Canaanites, his allies, the Midianites, or even that of his own nation of Moab. He's attempting to work against God, the creator of the universe. So from Numbers 22, 4b to 7. So Balak, son of Zippor, who was the king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor, near the Euphrates River in his native land. Balak said, "A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and they've settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said. Now, as we go along in the story, we will soon discover that this tactic totally backfires. What was Balak's error? No matter how many sacrifices he makes to appease and gain the favor of whatever God he felt would help him in this matter, his request will be denied. But what of the sorcerer? His story is a little more complicated. The elders of Moab and Midian are sent by Balak to employ a well-known Midianite sorcerer, Balaam of Peor. Biblical scholars tell us that ancient records attest to the existence of this once famous sorcerer. But what is less clear is how it is that he has come to believe in God, the creator of the universe, whom he refers to as the Lord my God. So that's Numbers 22:18. Despite his stated affiliation, we shouldn't understand Balaam as having the kind of relationship with God as that of a godly man, like an Elijah or an Isaiah. As the story goes, we might come to think of him more along the lines of a shaman or a voodoo priest even. He has come to rely on the power provided to him through various spiritual beings in his trade, and God has made himself known, for whatever reason, to Balaam on some level. So when these elders of Balaam come to Balaam with their request, he tells them to stay the night and he'll inquire of God as to what he should do. God shows up and makes it very clear to Balaam that he is not to go with these men, and he's not to curse the Israelites, for God himself has blessed them. So the next morning, Balaam sends them on their way, having rejected the commission. But the king of Moab, Balak, he's not so easily put off. He sends a second contingent, a larger number of men, and more prestigious than the first. Well, instead of reminding them of God's very clear directions previously, Balaam invites them to stay the night and he'll again inquire of God. This time, God appears to permit Balaam to join the group, but he is under very strict instructions to do only what God tells him to do. It appears to me that God is aware that the sorcerer will eventually be persuaded by money and prestige, no matter what he says to the contrary. He will answer Balak's summons, whether God directs him to or not, which is why I think God appears to change his mind. That night, God came to Balaam and said, "Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you." So Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, it turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat it to get back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat it with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, "You've made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you've always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" Balaam admitted, "Well, no." Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. The angel of the Lord asked him, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I've come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it hadn't turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, and I would have spared it." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned. I didn't realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you're displeased, I'll go back." The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." So Balaam went with Balak's officials. So what was Balaam's error? Well, Balaam is a sorcerer for hire, and he evidently has no qualms about cursing anyone for the right price, and in this case, God's chosen people. God allows him to go, but I believe that what we are witnessing is not God waffling, but rather the distinction between his perfect and his permissive will. God was permitting him to go according to Balaam's own free choice, but God had no intention of allowing the sorcerer to pronounce a curse on his children. If it was not for Balaam's donkey, he would never have lived to complete the trip. The angel of the Lord tells him that if it hadn't been for the actions of the donkey, he would have killed him by now. Balaam realizes the danger his disobedience placed him in and offers to return home. The angel of the Lord then reasserts the need for absolute obedience in this matter, and Balaam resumes his journey with God's warning firmly planted in his mind. And so begins the story contained in chapters 23 and 24. Balak shows Balaam the encroaching people of Israel from 2 separate vantage points. Altars are built, sacrifices made, Balaam performs an act of divination seeking an omen, and God has Balaam pronounce a blessing over the people, much to the growing irritation of Balak. But Balak doesn't give up. A 3rd time, he shows a portion of the people to Balaam, seeking a curse for just the small group. 7 altars are again made, a bull and a ram sacrificed on each, but this time, Balaam gives up the pretense of divining a different answer from God. As he looked out over the wilderness, the Bible tells us that the Spirit of God came upon him, and he again spoke a blessing on the Israelites, but also additionally, a curse on any who would choose to curse them. Well, Balak's heard enough and angrily tells the sorcerer to go home and refuses to pay him for his services. He says, "I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded." Well, Balaam delivers a few more messages, then they part ways. We don't hear any more of Balak, but Balaam's story, it's not over. In the very next chapter, it appears that the sorcerer is enlisted by his own people, the Midianites, to devise a means of dealing with the Israelites, and his own plan is far more treacherous. He encourages the Moabite and Midianite women to be, well, friendly with the Israelite men. They're invited to a feast together in worship of their god, the Baal of Peor. And some of the men fall and or run directly into the baited trap to be unfaithful, both to their fellow Israelites and to God. God's immediate response is to send a plague on the Israelites, which only stops when the guilty parties are killed. But his retribution isn't complete. The Midianites, who might have been spared, are now on God's list for vengeance. 12,000 men are selected, 1,000 from each tribe, and all the men, boys, and women are killed, along with Balaam of Peor. Numbers 31:16 tells us very clearly why. It says the women were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident. So a plague struck the Lord's people. Balaam may have heard God tell him not to curse the people of Israel, but he had not understood God's reasoning or the significance his future actions against them would entail. God made it very clear that his intent was to bless the Israelites as long as they remained faithful. In fact, he had set a plan in motion when he chose Abraham way back that would bless all the nations. Every year brought them closer to its fulfillment. Genesis 15:13-16 says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end, they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you'll die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction." So they have now completed the 400 years. This is where they are. The promise has been fulfilled. Then in Genesis 22, God promised Abraham, "I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants far beyond number, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me." So what was God's plan? Well, God's perfect will to provide a rescuer from the line of Abraham that would crush the serpent as promised as far back in the garden in Genesis 3:15 continued on unabated. Abraham's descendants would endure, and from them would come God's rescuer. Nothing any adversary was ever going to try was going to divert God's perfect will. This did not, however, remove the possibility of the people choosing to exercise their free will within his permissive will. We've already seen how God punished the Israelites and had them wander for 40 years for their rebellion as a result of their choosing their will over his. And through God's permissive will, they had experienced a detour, but it hadn't changed his perfect will. The plan remained the same. He was engineering a great escape for all humanity from the slavery of sin. So what lessons are there for us today? Well, let's begin with Balak. He tried to outsmart God. He refused to recognize that the power behind the Israelites' success could not be undone simply by attempting some sort of counter curse. He assumed he understood the full situation with the Israelites sprawled across his doorstep. Here was a powerful nation looking to claim territory for itself, and he needed to act before they stripped his land bare and enslaved his people. He ended up trying to stack the deck in his favor without understanding the rules of the game. He observed something and misinterpreted what it meant. How often do we try to solve apparent problems only to find our attempts frustrated? Balak jumped to a solution that failed miserably because he approached it from a worldly point of view. He had no conception that this was all part of a much larger, all-encompassing plan created by the Lord of all. His plan failed because he was clueless to the fact that there was no power on earth and no curse for anyone who God blessed. Before we rush headlong into trying to solve our dilemmas, might I suggest that we take some time to stop and ask God to give us his perspective on the situation. We could save ourselves a lot of aggravation, worry, wasted time, and resources if we first consulted the one who knows everything and is master of the grand design of the entirety of the creation from beginning to end. Balaam, on the other hand, sought to use God for his own purposes, for profit, for prestige, for his own self-importance. He had made a reputation for himself as one who was closely connected with a divine power source. But ultimately, he was a fraud. Despite knowing enough about God to recognize that he should be consulted, it's obvious that he supposed that God could be manipulated and persuaded to change his mind about something he had already given very clear instructions about. Even after telling Balak that he could not do or say anything that was not approved of by God, he still went about making sacrifices in an attempt to change God's mind. 3 times Balak asked that Balaam would curse the Israelites, and each time 7 altars were built, 7 bulls and 7 rams were sacrificed, yet nothing changed. It took that much for Balaam to finally become convinced that no amount of sacrifices was going to engender a different response from God and earn him Balak's promised reward. How often do we try to change God's mind? It's natural for us to want healing from illness, financial freedom, relations free of conflict, natural disasters averted, and on and on. Natural, good. Nobody should want to suffer. But sometimes God knows it is through those very things that we will allow him to work a greater transformation on our hearts, our character, our relationship with him, and our obedience to him. Instead of seeing all difficulties as evil, we need to begin believing that God can do amazing things despite the difficulties if we will fully trust him. He has a plan and a purpose, so whether our experiences are enjoyable or not, we can still be grateful in all circumstances. And as Balaam found out, if God is giving you a clear direction about something, don't tempt him to give you your own way and suffer the consequences for your belligerence. God has, as has been mentioned, both a permissive will and a perfect will. And while he may make course adjustments in response to our level of obedience and or rebellion, it will in no way stop his ultimate plan from being realized. God is the creator of all and therefore sovereign. We can choose to act like resentful teenagers who mistakenly believe that once we gain our independence from our parent, we will be entirely free from all rules and limitations. Or we can become spiritually mature, recognizing that God has a plan and a purpose for each one of us, one for which he specifically designed us for. And we have the privilege of participating in his plans together with him. But for me, one of the most interesting things to note from this story is that whether or not the Israelites realized that a sorcerer had been commissioned to curse them, they had nothing to fear. God was intervening on their behalf without their knowledge and without their asking. We too can be confident that God is daily protecting us from dangers and problems that we have no awareness of. So when stuff does happen that we do become aware of, we can possess reassurance that God has allowed it, even if we have no way of understanding why, because he is more than capable of dealing with threats before we even know they exist. Philippians 4:6-8 provides a wonderful reminder of the fact that God is the source, or to be the source of our peace. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything you can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. So readily do the good that God has given you to do, and trust that whatever he allows into your life, he is more than capable of helping you through it and in it.